Hi, Joe.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good, good.
Good.
How
Let me
are you?
introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Joseph Blankholm at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the Religious Studies Department. And ironically, we're going to talk about not very religious people for the most part, or at least not very religious in the conventional sense. I guess a good backdrop to this conversation is the fact that they just had the Reason Rally on the Mall in Washington, D.C. That was the second ever. The first one was in 2012. And they describe their mission there as celebrating the secular, the atheist, agnostic, humanist, free thinking, and non religious identities. And I think they also, to some extent, just want to make themselves known as a phenomenon, including a political phenomenon. There are some public policy issues that got discussed there. And anyway, you've done a lot of work in this area, studying, non-believers, secularism, the meaning of the terms secularism, humanism, and the changing meaning of some of these terms, atheist, agnostic. In fact, I think in the forthcoming edition of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Religion in America, the article on atheism will have been written by you. Is that true?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So you're our guy then, and I wanted to, talk a lot about this increasingly important kind of territory because its population seems to be growing. And I wanted to start out by just asking, what do all of I guess it would be hard to find anything that all of tens of thousands of people have in common, any one thing that they all have in common. But if you look at the basic groups that were the key sponsors of this event, so like, I guess, Center for Inquiry, several others, what is it possible to say what these constituencies all have in common?
Yeah. It's interesting because you're absolutely right. There are a lot of differences there. But I think they have two things in common, and they're really different kinds of things, which is the struggle. So, on the one hand, I mean, if you're not religious, if you're atheistic, even if you're agnostic, these are negating prefixes. It says more about what's not present in a
Mm-hmm.
way. So there's not a lot of belief in the supernatural in the crowd. There's not a lot of I guess you'd say belief that there are parts of the world that contravene the laws of nature. So there's a lot of naturalists. But then this gets us to the other side, which is the kind of positive description of what's actually believed,
Mm-hmm.
which is usually physicalism or materialism, a kind of monism. So an argument that the world is only made of one substance. That substance can be known empirically. Science is the best way of knowing it. Usually some assumptions about how language works as well.
Yeah. Of
So
course, I doubt all the
it's
people at that rally would be capable of putting together the sentences you just put together. I mean, I don't mean to insult them. It's just that not everyone who is an activist in this field thinks about what their epistemology, metaphysics, and so on are. But but
absolutely
but I guess is the deal that research has shown that the kind of leaders in these fields, if you press them, they are basically scientific in their outlook, and they are materialist in their kind of metaphysics and so on.
right. Yeah. So spending years hanging out with people in local and national groups, this is what I gather, and I listened a lot for what they affirm, and I listened a lot for what they really don't. So I think Sam Harris has been interesting the way he's started adopting spirituality more. When I was conducting my research back mostly in 2012 and 2013, that really wasn't the case. So there's a lot of things that are sort of not on the table, and there are some things that are, and listening carefully to what people say. The other thing I would say is at the national level, the national leadership, there's a lot of really clever people who can, I'd say, like maybe discourse switch. So they have a way of talking to me sometimes that's different than how they would talk in a press release or maybe to their general membership. And they're pretty conversant. I was generally really impressed with
So in
people.
other words, they will talk philosophy to you, but that wouldn't come out in a press release. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely right. Yeah, and they'll speak at a pretty high level too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, there's definitely some very learned people involved in this, especially at the leadership level. So okay, so the common kind of philosophical framework broadly. Uh, Beyond that, I mean, maybe one way to put it is We've heard a lot about the nuns, NONES, when you do a survey and you say, do you have any religious affiliation? And they say none, I guess, is the question that that's a response to. This is in a way not as broad as that group, right? Because that group turns out to include some people who actually believe something supernatural, but just aren't conventionally or institutionally religious, right? This is kind of a subset of that group.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So if you're a religious nun, an NONE, you are religiously unaffiliated. And it really only gets at one of the three major aspects that sociologists, political scientists look at when they're looking at religion. So you're looking at belief, behavior, and belonging. Well, it says you don't belong religiously. It doesn't really tell us anything about your beliefs or your behavior. So the people at the Reason Rally, for the most part, but not entirely, they are the non-religious. They're people who do not believe, belong, or behave religiously. But of course, you had Ann Clayson on your show, so this all breaks down pretty quickly with certain subgroups.
Well, elaborate on that. I mean, what does she represent that not everyone there would represent? She is at the New York, I guess, Ethical Culture Society. If that's,
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot of phrases with ethical culture in them, but she is a kind of a minister there. And so elaborate on what, at the distinctions you're talking about.
So there's a really interesting range of organized non-believers in the United States. And a lot of the older groups, they, if not always, they can identify as religious. So ethical culture, most people in the ethical culture movement at the New York Society for Ethical Culture and the other ethical culture societies around the country, they identify as religious humanists. And the same is true for people who are members of societies for humanistic Judaism. And you can also find a very small minority who are members of the American Humanist Association. And so you have people who identify as religious non-theists. And then, of course, you have people who are non-theists who would not even go to a bar to meet up with non-theists because that would be joining a religious group. So you really have the full spread, and it's a really interesting spread.
And what do the people who use the term religious mean by it? Since many conventionally religious people would say they are by definition not religious if they don't believe in God.
Right. So they definitely don't mean religious belief. They mean religious belonging. And so if you survey them, they're probably not showing up in the religiously unaffiliated. They're not the nuns, technically speaking, because they'll put other for religious affiliation. And
so I was wrong to say this is that the Reason Rally is a subset of the nuns. They're actually, on the Venn diagram, there's a large area of overlap, but there's three different zones, really.
Yeah, that's technically true. It's a little difficult, I think, that way. I gave a talk at a Ethical Culture Society a couple years ago now, and was talking about the nuns because Pew was doing all this research breaking down that category, and a very astute emeritus political science professor said, "Hey, we are not the religiously unaffiliated," and it was he's completely correct. They really weren't, and I sort of asked some people in the room, and some of them would have actually put no religion if asked, and others would have put others. So it gets a little messy there.
Okay, and so to get back to what humanists who consider themselves religious mean, is it that they are part of a group that functions the way religions function? In other words, they get together and have community and have ethical principles that guide them? Is that what they mean?
Yeah, some of it's absolutely functionalist. And some of it's also, it's really, they come from a time before we formed our understanding of how secular and religious are separate. That boundary was really hardened during the Cold War period. If you look at the jurisprudence, the Supreme Court jurisprudence from 1947 to 1990, that's really when we get most of our separation of church and state jurisprudence. And so groups like Ethical Culture, founded in 1876, even groups like the American Humanist Association, founded in 1941, but really coming out of the Unitarian Church in the early part of the 20th century, these groups, they're sort of holdovers from a prior way of drawing this boundary. So when they say they're religious, they mean they're kind of, they're getting together in groups, often on Sundays, maybe singing hymns. They're doing religious things and they're looking religious, and they're doing interfaith work at times as well. So they're not believing in supernatural entities, but they're doing all the other things that might, exactly, be functions of religion. They come out of a legacy that even produced functionist sociology if you want to go back to Comte. It's kind of an interesting entangled history.
Mm-hmm. And I would think that when the ethical culture movement started in the 19th century, just as a practical matter, if you had not argued that you're a religion, you would have had even more trouble finding a foothold, right? I mean, not being religious was much more of a marginalizing thing back then than it is now. So there might have been some savvy politics in that label. I don't know.
That's true. I think there is a way in which, for some people, it probably was savvy politics. I think for other people, I mean, there's also a genuine attempt to make the category of religion a little bit bigger, to force it to include non-theists. And so, I mean, that's definitely present in Felix Adler. The Unitarians that are coming out of the Transcendentalist movement, I mean, they genuinely, I think sincerely, if we can adopt that rather Protestant term, they think of themselves as religious, and they just think that should be a bigger umbrella.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, maybe that's an interesting point, because I know Anne is herself pluralistic, and I think that's a matter of doctrine at the Ethical Culture Society, that they welcome people who have theistic beliefs. It's not definitionally true of someone who shows up at one of their services that they not believe in God, although almost everyone who shows up probably doesn't believe in God. But the point is, they are not exclusivist.
Right. Right. And they're not very literalist necessarily about what they mean by God, which gets really fun. So when you're talking to people, sometimes they'll say, well, if God is nature, if God is coextensive with nature, then yeah, I absolutely believe in God. So they're hyper conscious of, I mean, I had one gentleman talk to me about Wittgenstein and how he felt like it was a language game, and reference Spinoza directly and say, it really depends on what you mean by these terms. And so when you're talking to someone like that who doesn't adopt a really strict understanding of what a word can possibly mean, words like God and religion, they get pretty flexible as well.
Well, and that happens in liberal theology too.
Yep.
So a kind of much more recently formed group than the Ethical Culture Society is the Sunday Assembly movement, sometimes called an atheist church. They're interesting because I think they'd qualify for the term religion. I mean, objectively speaking, to the extent that the Ethical Culture Society would. I mean, they come together, they have services, they sing. I think they certainly have music. They have, broadly speaking, they have a set of ethical principles. They even meet on Sunday. But I doubt they use the word religious, do they, to describe themselves?
Actually, okay, so sometimes, there's a way in which, I went to the first Sunday assembly that was held at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Mm-hmm. There was one that preceded it that was held in a bar. This one was when Sanderson
That's
Jones...
one contrast with many of the church services that people are familiar with. It was held in a bar.
Absolutely.
We'll pass over that, yeah.
And it felt a little bit like an evangelical service, if we really want to get into how messy it is. Mm-hmm. But I'll just leave that aside for now as well.
What do you mean by that, though?
There
was enthusiasm.
Static. It was built around a band playing popular music. Right. There are these moments of crowd interaction, and members of the audience encouraged to interact with one another. I used to study evangelicals, and so it set off some alarms for me, or some not alarms.
That's not a scholarly way to put it.
It is not, no. Right. But there was definitely some isomorphism, I think, would be the scholarly.
That's the scholarly way to put it, because no one understands what it means. That's a perfectly scholarly way to put it. Okay, so now there is with Sunday Assembly. So you maybe, I don't know. I don't think they use the term religion as self-consciously as the ethical culture people do. But they have one thing in common with them, I think, that gets at something I'm really interested in, which is that they also, I believe, are not exclusivist. In fact, I think early on, this was an issue of contention within the Sunday Assembly movement. There were people who wanted to say, no, this is an atheist church, atheists only. But I think they lost out. And now Sunday Assembly doesn't provide a litmus test, even though if you went there and asked people, virtually everyone would say either I'm an atheist or an agnostic. But still, there is a more pluralistic feel and a more pluralistic doctrine, I think, governing Sunday Assembly, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You can, I think they put it in various terms. You can sort of leave your beliefs at the door, and we really accept everybody. There was an interesting phrase that Sanderson used about religion. He said, um, if there's a rock in your shoe, you don't throw away the shoe. So there's a way in which they're very self-consciously adapting religion. But you're right. It's almost a non-pluralism in the sense that there aren't silos.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't like specific positions being located in a plurality. But there's like just we're just going to sort of leave out the God talk. We're going to leave out talk of beliefs in general, which then gets us into this funny place where, are we talking about a secular in which God is absent, or are we talking about a secular neutral? So yeah, they're definitely playing with that. They're sort of saying, maybe beliefs don't have to be here. But you talk to emerging evangelicals, you hear something similar, which is very interesting.
Uh-huh. You mean you don't have to be a believer to enter their church and attend a service?
Almost beyond that, you don't even have to believe. And belief as a question is de-emphasized. Mm-hmm. And they also will read in some of these very non-literal and metaphorical ways as well. Although at this point, they probably wouldn't even call themselves emerging. They would have other terms or eschew terms altogether. It's really interesting. I think the Sunday Assembly and emerging evangelicals are sort of converging around a similar set of concerns about wanting to form communities, but also feeling a kind of crisis of belief in some ways.
That's interesting. I don't think of evangelicals as suffering from a crisis of belief. I mean, comparatively speaking, if you asked me, to name 3 groups that are suffering from a crisis of belief, evangelicals would not spring to mind. But that's interesting. There's also, of course, a political distinction. I mean, I think Sunday Assembly tends to be liberal. So does the Ethical Culture Society. Evangelicals famously don't tend to be, although there are liberal evangelicals.
There absolutely are. And a lot of them are going to be more on that. Well, it's not that most liberal evangelicals are like the emerging style, but a lot who are the emerging style, who are invested in things like new monasticism, where they're living in intentional communities with many couples or often co-ed communities working on certain community service projects. They're also more liberal. Yeah.
So is there, I hadn't heard this, is there more growth in the liberal part of evangelicism now, or is there more dynamism, or is there neither of those?
Yeah, I would almost say don't call it a comeback. There's a way in which we've stereotyped evangelicals and not fully acknowledged the continued minority presence mm-hmm. of liberals. And especially as the nuns are in some ways a product of the association of conservative religion or conservative politics with religion. And so there's a kind of exodus out of religion by mainline liberals. And then there's also a kind of turn away from that form of religion among evangelicals as well. So you might hear them talk about being spiritual but not religious. They're talking about not being limited by the structures of the church.
Now, to get back to the Reason Rally, would you think that spiritual is not a very popular term there? Now, I'm sure you could find somebody there who would say I'm spiritual but not religious, but is it not kind of like a cool word among that crowd to the extent that we can generalize about a fairly diverse crowd?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's changing a little bit, especially among really young people, college-age people, because I find that they haven't formed their ideas quite as solidly yet about what's the in and out boundary, and they have a certain more amount of flexibility. But I completely agree. I mean, Sam Harris has no doubt made some headway in this respect, but he hasn't changed the culture completely.
No, and it's almost kind of ironic that he would be the one to bring spiritual into this, in a certain sense, because in other ways he represents the militant side of the spectrum, right?
Absolutely, it's amazing. It's for someone like me who's very interested in the moments in which things appear contradictory because they then demand explanation, they demand better explanations. He's a fascinating case. I mean, if you look at The End of Faith, that 2004 book, so much of it is dedicated to meditation and his sort of explorations in that area. So it doesn't really come out of nowhere, but I was surprised. I think
it goes way back in his own life. And I don't think it's a recent invention. I just mean it's ironic, I guess I would say, in the sense that the part of the atheist movement he represents is generally, I don't think of it as very pluralistic and inclusivist. I mean, let me elaborate a little. I think in talking to the people in the kind of ethical culture society, Sunday assembly space, I find a fair number of people who don't think that religion is like the biggest problem with the world, and they don't, when they see like conflicts in the Middle East or whatever, they don't assume that religion is the prime mover. And that's partly because, as I said, they are liberals. Liberals are more likely to pay attention to what they would call root causes and say, no, look at the material circumstances that gave rise to the conflict, economic, political, whatever. It isn't belief per se, even if violence is justified in terms of belief. So that's them, and to me it makes sense that they are also pluralistic and inclusivists because they don't think religion per se is the problem. Whereas Sam thinks religion per se is the problem, and yet he's the one bringing the word spiritual into the atheist. It's just kind of ironic. It's not a big deal, but
yeah, absolutely. He's in some ways responding to the same set of assumptions about religion that have produced an efflorescence of spirituality in the late 20th, early 21st centuries, because spirituality gets to be the thing that doesn't have the structure. It's not the tradition. It's not the, these are the way we use these terms. It's not the tradition. It's not the creed. It's not the formalistic aspect. It's the kind of part that connects the individual, the autonomous individual especially, with a kind of truth about reality, with a deeper meaning. And so in that way, by having such a defined idea of what religion is and what kind of problem it is, he's able to separate it from spirituality. Mm-hmm. And so he's in some ways, reacting to the same pile of things. I agree that it is a surprising turn.
Yeah. And it also somewhat complicates, or could eventually complicate, the generalization that these people are fundamentally materialist in their outlook. I don't mean that you can't use the term spiritual and have a materialist outlook, because I think you can. And it's not clear to me that Sam does not have a materialist outlook, but in that book on Waking Up, or whatever it's called, he was flirting, I thought, well, in talking about consciousness, and I think he was just acknowledging the complexity of the issue, that it doesn't in some obvious way fit into a materialist framework. I think that's true, but he was starting to, go to, it wasn't clear that you would call him, after reading that book, like a hardcore materialist, I guess.
I think he stops short of sort of making some of the claims about connecting to a transcendent consciousness or something like that. In some ways, I think he's, it's sort of like Felix Adler in a way, where he believes in universals and the transcendence of these universals, or the sort of the universality of universals, if I'm going to be redundant about it. And so there's really a truth out there, and you can maybe get at it through these practices. But I think he does stop short of there being anything that can't be known empirically, or that would contravene what we know.
Although when he's talking about insights that you only have by meditating, he's talking about an insight that is not scientifically derived, because what experiences I have when I meditate are not amenable to science. No one else can see them. It is part of the definition of scientific inquiry that it deals with phenomena that more than one person can observe. So anyway, I don't want to have the argument with you.
No, there's a wonderfully rich literature on religious experience. There's actually one of my colleagues wrote a book called Religious Experience Reconsidered, and Taves, and it's really trying to address this question of how you approach the religious experience, whether it's a private thing that can't be accessed, how you might talk about it empirically. So it's a difficult topic. Absolutely.
Okay. Let me ask you this about the Reason rally. I know you weren't there this time, but since you have studied these groups, and I should say also, you're not an anthropologist quite, but you do some kind of de facto anthropology, I think, as you go through and observe these different groups. Tell me, what, at any gathering like this that's pretty diverse, it seems to me the people who are there are aware of sub-schools within the gathering. It can be an academic conference, It can be a political, ideological conference. If it was conservatives, you'd say, well, here's the religious right, here's the libertarians. What is it clear to you what the most prominent divisions are in a group like the one assembled at the Reason rally? I mean, does it have to do with some of the things we've been talking about, like pluralism versus, whatever the opposite is, exclusivism, I guess you could say, or what? What are the most prominent cleavages you see?
Yeah, they organize in some ways around the cleavages that produce the various groups, and people are pretty sensitive to them who are active enough to go to the Reason Rally. I found well, the last question when I was interviewing anybody, I said, I didn't even ask it. I just said the labels question, and they would talk to me about the various labels they use. Secular humanists is definitely one of them. They have a really interesting history. Paul Kurtz broke away from the American Humanist Association in the late 70s, founded the Council for Secular Humanism, eventually an umbrella organization, the Center for Inquiry. So people who identify as specifically a secular form of humanism. There are people that eschew any kind of adjective that would qualify it. So that's going to be your humanists more broadly. Sometimes American Humanist Association will take that stance. We're not going to qualify it.
What don't they like about the word secular?
I think it's not so much that they dislike the word secular, but they feel like once you add it to humanist, it creates divisions.
Right.
So if you're a religious humanist who, I don't know, agrees about what exists and what the best way to know it is, but you have this, you get together on Sundays and you're like, hey, call me religious. Then suddenly you're apart from people who are secular humanists, even though you disagree on pretty much everything else. And so just by calling yourself humanist, it's a bigger tent. And then you can invoke this longer history. Also, AHA is involved in some lawsuits where they're very strategic about identifying as religious and seeking protections as a religious minority. So they have these very sort of concrete disagreements that will become more salient, say court cases or something like that. And then there's an atheism plus subset, which is people who are much more dedicated to feminist values and in general, like participating in the new civil rights movement that we're in the middle of right now, and sort of pushing toward more progressive values associated with atheism.
Mm-hmm.
I think people sense all these things. And then you have, maybe what you'd call more like hardline or hardcore atheists, people who half-jokingly call themselves evangelical atheists, who joke about how they're proselytizing. Those people might be different from people who are more on the rationalist side. Skeptics, the skeptic movement, you can even be religious and skeptic. There are definitely people who are. So most skeptics that I met are not religious, but that's sort of a big tent. Some of those people might be there as well, just because reason is intentionally a bigger tent than just atheism or something like that.
Yeah. What does skeptic mean, actually? I mean, it started out being known, I think, for like debunking magicians who claimed they weren't just magicians, right? And could do ESP and stuff. But has it become a little more than that? What we think of as the skeptic movement. I mean, I think of Skeptic Magazine, Michael Shermer, and
Right.
The Amazing Randy, and so on. But is that
right? Exactly. Yeah, and then that obviously has a deeper tradition among magicians, going back to Houdini and his attempts to debunk spiritualists, and it's just kind of this nice legacy of really of people like spiritualists and people doing seances and people like Uri Geller on the one side, and people like skeptics on the other, co-constituting each other and kind of creating a media public, which is a sort of fascinating history. But yeah, the skeptic movement is definitely a movement that's distinct. There are people who identify in it. So I did this thing with a colleague at Princeton named Alf Garcia. We built this database of all the local non-believer groups in the country. And we also kept track of groups that are avowedly skeptic. And we looked closely at how they understand themselves. And there were hundreds of these groups, but we didn't include them in the non-believer set because most of them were distinguishing themselves in very subtle ways from making these sort of ontological claims like non-believer groups would. So there is a movement. They're interested, right, in debunking. When I was going to like drinking skeptically, which is something that's organized in many places around the country through Meetup, people were concerned with anti-vaxxers, anti-vaccine people. They're much more interested in, I don't know, making sure that people have a scientific understanding of the world, and that could benefit the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned earlier that some groups, like at the Reason Rally, are more interested in agitating for certain kind of, I guess, liberal domestic policies than others. My sense is that, in generally, on domestic issues, this is a pretty fairly broadly liberal group, right?
Yeah, it is.
And fairly libertarian on lifestyle issues, at least, leaving economics aside. It's interesting, on foreign policy, in just talking to people, I find a big divergence of opinion on the one hand. So, for example, Sam Harris, I would think more kind of hawkish on the right, and some of these other people more on the left, in accordance with what I said earlier about them kind of believing that, a lot of foreign policy problems have to do with root causes and so on. A kind of traditionally liberal view of these things. They might tend to be more dovish, and yet it's my sense that this is not a very prominent dividing line. Like I wouldn't imagine that if I went to the Reason rally, I would hear a lot of people talking about this particular disagreement. So, like, the speakers included Bill Mayer, who's on some of these issues kind of on the right, I think, but and some speakers who wouldn't be, but I wouldn't expect that to get nearly as much airtime as the domestic policy issues, where there's right.
Yeah, I agree. I think in some ways it tells you about the kind of atheists that are participating in the Reason rally. We're not talking about the radical Marxists and anarchists. We're not talking about the people that are going to show up at a WTO protest or something like that, which are also, are also maybe hardline identifying secularist, even anti-religion people, but they have very different politics. They're invested in a different tradition. They're invested in that Marxist tradition. And so I absolutely agree. The people who are showing up to these, they're in some ways a little more mainstream liberal in that sense. And yeah, in foreign policy, there can be huge hawk dove divides. It's really interesting how the new atheists have framed themselves in terms of foreign policy in general. I saw them as doing, so there's this interesting 20th century political theorist, Carl Schmitt, who thinks about the concept of the political, and really the political is a situation in which you have an enemy. And you can have a domestic and an external enemy. And so I really saw someone like Hitchens consciously aligning your domestic and foreign enemies in the wake of 9/11 and in the wake of the 2000 Bush election. So you had evangelicals domestically, and you had Muslims abroad, and they're both religion. And here we have this elegant way we can identify the things we don't like. And that, I think, didn't fully take off as a narrative in the way that he had hoped.
Although, ironically, he agreed with a lot of the evangelicals about the Muslims abroad thing. In other words, they would agree that the problem is in some sense religious, and you just got to kill these people because there's no hope otherwise, right? And so, yeah, I guess kind of rich in irony. When you said it was interesting how the new atheists had framed themselves in terms of foreign policy, or framed the foreign policy, did you just meant that it's interesting that they turned out to kind of go right wing, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's something that I think maybe I'm sensitive to, especially being in the academy where there are so many people who identify as atheists or so many people who identify as secular. But if you're in the humanistic academy, if you're in anthropology, if you're in social sciences, people's foreign policy views are generally not that hawkish. Right. So when you see something like in, Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, there's a section on this. Richard Dawkins' God Delusions is a section on this. They're talking about educating Muslims, so setting up Western schools and things like that. I mean, talk to an anthropologist about that. There's a way in which that simply doesn't fly. And so I do think it's interesting, the way they have a particular view that's it's really distinct from academic atheism as it's developed.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look at that Dennett book again. I had thought of him as, Dan Dennett is not so much a part of this right-wing drift on foreign policy. He certainly doesn't talk about it the way, and even Dawkins and Harris are different on a lot of specifics, but you don't, Dennett doesn't say the kinds of things that the other two have said. So I don't really know where he is.
No, he doesn't say, let's bomb them to the Stone Age or something like that. But it's a question of education. And then, what is Western education? What does it mean to educate people? What does it mean to form them as subjects through a prism of the West? And then that's where, 30 years of anthropology really comes up against that.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Now, you've done a lot of interesting work on the history of these terms, in particular, secular and humanism. So going back to the 19th century, when I guess the word secular became an ism. Now, the word secular itself goes back much further. But talk a little about like where that comes from, and then how in the 19th century that word starts entering this particular discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So secular, it comes from Latin and really points to cycle. So if you're doing like a search for 19th century documents that the internet allows us to do, a lot of the instances of secular that come up are like in astronomy. because they're just referring to cycles. So there's this much older sense of the term, and in the religious context, it means priests who are not in a monastery but out in the world. They're of the world in some way, so they're secular.
So it means mundane in a sense, of the worldly.
Right.
I mean, somehow cyclical evolved into that, I guess, somehow, the cyclical
Right.
meaning of it. You still hear the cyclical meaning among statisticians, by the way. They'll talk about secular trends, and I guess that's what they mean.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and in banking as well.
Yeah, but so anyway, it came to mean of this world as distinguished from the heavenly, the transcendent, right?
Right, from the eternal, which is outside of time, in,
Right.
say, Augustine's theology. So that meaning persists for a long time. It becomes a way of sort of, you can talk about secularizing church holdings, which is to sort of bring them outside possession of the church. And then as an ism, it doesn't really develop until 1851 with this guy, George Jacob Holyoake, who's involved in labor activism and who really wants to find a movement that's not specifically atheist, that's less certain about what exists and what doesn't exist, but still wants to get people together around a this worldly focus, to talk about a this worldly oriented morality, and incubates some ideas in his journal, The Reasoner, and then settles on this term after it's suggested to him.
Okay, and so he means it in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
It comes to be a term of almost derision. I mean, certainly secular humanist, as of the middle of the century, is being used as an accusation, right? As the
Right.
middle of the 20th century, I mean.
Right, absolutely. And even so you have this Jerusalem conference in the late 1920s, and where secularism is identified as the boogeyman or the bugaboo for the Protestant ecumenical movement. So secularism has these various, secularism and secular humanism has these various turns in which it exists as the opponent for various religious efforts. You're absolutely right. And when you look at sort of, Reinhold Niebuhr giving a lecture in the 1940s, secular humanism is the bad thing opposed to Christian humanism. And then in the wake of 1961, you have this very interesting lawsuit, Torcaso v. Watkins. There's a footnote in that lawsuit written by Justice Hugo Black in the majority opinion, in which he identifies secular humanism and ethical culture among the religions that are non-theistic, but actually religions. And so in the wake of that, you have a movement on the Christian right to identify secular humanism as a religion, because they make this little move that's very important, which is they say, okay, secular humanism is actually the established religion of the United States, so we should be able to use the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to combat that and to combat the teaching of evolution as a tenet of secular humanism. And it becomes this wedge and this lever for all these legal efforts and really also legislation that's put forward.
That's really clever.
It's very clever, absolutely.
That
It's
you shouldn't
ultimately
be
a
able to
failed
teach
effort,
science because it's a religion, basically, right?
Right, exactly.
I don't know what you do wind up teaching if you rule that out, but if if that's religion and you can't teach religion, I don't know what exactly would be left in the end. But so that's interesting. And then humanism has its separate humanism, which gets mixed up in this hybrid label, has a separate history, right? Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think people generally think humanism, they think Renaissance humanism, they think the sort of recovery of the antique, the sort of world of antiquity, and Greek philosophy. But really, humanism as a term originates among the followers of Auguste Comte, who is a 19th century guy. He's really the grandfather of sociology, the grandfather of anthropology, very brilliant, but if you read his works, clearly very eccentric. And there are a lot of sort of liberal Protestants and freethinkers in the late 19th century who are looking at what he's doing by building his so-called religion of humanity, and they say, well, he's just evacuating the beliefs of Catholicism, taking the structures, and creating another religion. He does all kinds of interesting things when he does that, though, because functional equivalent of religion, where you can put different belief contents in. And then the effect of that is his followers who want to create non-theistic religions, who want to organize people around what in fact they do believe in, look to this term humanist that develops out of religion of humanity. And you can sort of trace where the term gets used and where those people's allegiances are. And that's how it emerges in the late 19th and very early 20th century.
Now, did Comte really want to create a religion of, turns science into a religion, or am I just getting him mixed up with Saint Simon, who didn't Comte kind of follow someone in that, or not?
Yeah, he absolutely did. There's sort of a proliferation of secular religions in the wake of the French Revolution. You have, churches being turned into temples of reasons, and so there's a real pattern to this idea. There's also a sense, Holyoake used this quote as well, that you need to replace something in order to destroy it completely. And he and Comte were both very invested in this idea. So in as much as they wanted to move past religion and they saw Christianity as in some ways harmful, Holyoake takes a much gentler tack, relatively speaking. Comte really wants to create something that's going to replace it. And as it turns out, he's also going to be the high priest of it. So that pope role becomes his. There's a lot of power associated with that, obviously.
Convenient. Didn't work out, though, right?
Didn't really work out. Although, the Brazilian flag has their motto comes out of Comtean religion of humanity.
Really?
They did much better in Brazil, basically, than they did
motto?
pretty much anywhere else. What is it? It's order and something. I can't remember off the top of my head right now.
Probably order and reason, right? Or maybe not. Order and... Huh. Well, I
can't remember it.
That's interesting. Well, happily, everyone can Google it. Especially if they've got a head start with the ordo part. So secularism, this guy wanted it to be a movement in the 19th century. As that word evolved, it didn't have as much of that flavor, I think, moving into the heart of the 20th century as humanism had, right? I mean, now we have this combined frame, secular humanism, but humanism I think of as much more a movement animated by certain values, whereas I think of secular as being just this qualifying adjective that conveys that this humanism does not involve belief in God, right? And that's so that's kind of what the two. So humanism maintained this flavor of being like a thing, whereas secular is more like the absence of a thing in a certain sense. But anyway, the term, although used in an accusatory way, mid 20th century, has now, I gather, been embraced and adopted by some people who think it describes them, right?
Yeah, it really ebbs and flows. The terms really change. So, I mean, in the late 19th century, you also have free thinkers. And free thinkers include spiritualists. They include people who think that there are, you can speak to the dead. And free thinkers today is a much narrower term that refers specifically to people we would imagine are like secular humanists that are atheists, that kind of thing. So, yeah, secularism, capital S secularism that Holyoake founds, that really wanes in the late 19th century. Humanism picks up. And then secularism becomes more available as a boogeyman. And now, yeah, it's back in a lot of ways talking about secularism. I think there are concrete reasons for that. In as much as it's confusing, it allows for a lot of things to enter into its tent. It's a very productive form of confusion. Mm-hmm. So for instance, when I'm looking at secular lobbyists and the Secular Coalition for America, they have two parts of their mission. They promote separation of church and state, and they advocate for the rights of non-believers. So secularism really captures both sides of that mission. And with the separation of church and state half, you can go make coalitions with the Baptists who have long supported separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. You can go make coalitions with the United Church of Christ and people who are interested in promoting separation over on that side. So Barry Lynn, who's Americans United for Separation of Church and State, he's a UCC minister. But you can also say secularism. You could write the same sentence and support your non-theistic base, speak directly to their non-theistic identity. Also have this openly secular coalition encouraging people to come out as secular. So that multiplicity of meaning, really, really useful. It gets a lot of work done. And I think in some ways that's why secularism and secular has taken off in the past decade or so as an umbrella term, because it does work in multiple directions. Okay.
So Barry Lynn is a Congregationalist minister?
I believe UCC, United Church of Christ.
Oh, it's the United Church of Christ. Okay. I was thinking, did they, there's some relationship with the Congregationalists, I was thinking, but maybe not. Maybe, I was thinking there had been a merger. But I guess you're right. That's, I didn't even actually realize that he's a minister. I mean, a lot of times it doesn't come through. You wouldn't guess it to hear what he's talking about. But, so getting back to the Reason Rally, I mean, I guess first of all, I think one thing they tend to have in common, if you look at the groups kind of, the key sponsors of the Reason Rally, is like they want to have their space to be what they are preserved. That right? That is, above all, they don't want to be compelled to, I mean, to go back to the early issues, from 50 years ago, they do not want children compelled to pray in school, or even to say under God as part of the Pledge of Allegiance, probably. So they want, there's that. They want the government like out of their business, and a lot of them, and some of them, I guess, want protections comparable to the protections religions have. But then you get to this difference of strategy where some of them are arguing in court, we are a religion, and some of them aren't. But still, that's kind of a common set of concerns. Beyond that, when you look at the specific, let's talk about some of these specific groups and what they represent in terms of kind of ideology, I guess you would say. So you refer to the American Humanist Association, which I guess kind of grows out of the Unitarian Church. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Now we mentioned the Center for Inquiry, which it's funny. I think that's a group that the actor Steve Allen started. Is that right? Some decades ago, or not?
Paul Kurtz started that group in 1980. Well, that group was actually founded in 91, but it's Paul Kurtz's organization.
This is the Center for Inquiry.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So he was editor of Humanist magazine in the 1970s. And some pretty reliable reports say there's some evidence of financial malfeasance, and he ended up departing that organization in 78. And in some ways, to establish a new basis for his next endeavor, he doubles down on secular as a qualifier of humanism, and he also recognizes that it's an opponent of the religious right. So if you're against the religious right and you find Paul Kurtz very charismatic, you can follow him out in the late 70s to this new group, the Council for Secular Humanism. He's a philosophy professor at SUNY Buffalo, so their organization is based there still.
This is the Council for Secular Humanism.
Right.
But that's different. That's different from the Center for Inquiry, right? Or is it not?
They're the same, basically.
Are they?
So Council for Secular Humanism is a subgroup. Okay. Center for Inquiry is an umbrella group that contains them, and they contain it's SciCop. It's the Committee for, maybe it's now reduced to the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, okay. CSI. They run Skeptic Magazine. And then they also have a group that organizes on college campuses and some legal team and stuff like that.
And I mean, what I was going to say I was surprised by was that the on the Reason Rally website, they listed among the sponsors Center for Inquiry and the Dawkins Foundation separately, whereas I thought I'd read that the Dawkins Foundation was merging with the Center for Inquiry or being absorbed by it or something.
Yeah, I had read the same thing. It's interesting that they would list them separately.
Yeah.
My understanding is they are, in fact, merging. Maybe it hasn't happened officially yet, or maybe it's a way to sort of you can continue to signal Dawkins in name. And
yeah, I guess that it helps to have that name. But I had inferred from the merger that the Center for Inquiry, that would say something. I mean, the fact that the Dawkins Foundation fits naturally with it suggests that the Center for Inquiry was in some ways at the more militant end of the spectrum, kind of some distance from the AHA. Is that a fair inference?
Yeah, it's almost a sort of idiosyncrasy of their respective histories that's the case. Because Kurtz is leaving AHA, he really needs to double down to create a separation to sort of justify his departure. And he becomes the first organization that actually organizes secular humanists. Because really there hadn't been really a lot of people who identified as secular humanists before that. There hadn't been an institution. So he's taking this thing out of its footnote boogeyman place into institution. And then that creates a need to continue to produce a separation between religious and secular humanism, and to continue to produce a separation between AHA and Center for Inquiry and Kurtz's other endeavors. So it's a little bit of a idiosyncratic, charismatic leader kind of history to it. Yeah.
And then there's also the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is a different thing, but also kind of, I don't know if militant is the word, but aggressive in terms of the legal cases they bring and stuff, right? In fact, I guess that's the main thing they do is bring legal cases.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Exactly. Right. Yeah, they have over half a dozen lawyers on staff, and they're actually basically an offshoot of American Atheists, which was Madeline
Murray O'Hair. She did the famous court case in the early 60s that established that you couldn't have prayer in the public schools, right?
That's exactly, yeah. So I believe it was the case was Bible reading, Abington v. Shemp. It was Murray v. Curlett was merged into that case. Mm-hmm. But in the mid 70s, the Gaylors, a mother and daughter, the older Gaylor was expelled from American Atheists because Madeline Murray O'Hair was notoriously difficult in some ways, and so they founded Freedom from Religion Foundation out of that.
I see.
And they're really hard line in that American atheist tradition as well.
So like people come to them and say, I'm being discriminated against because I'm an atheist or something, and they examine the case and see if they want to take it, right?
Exactly. They take a couple thousand complaints a year, and they get a lot of work done just sending threatening letters.
So is it possible to say of the main groups, and I probably failed to list all the main groups, but like which ones have the most dynamism or, or the most youth and energy or anything like that? Is it clear that kind of history is on the side of some of them as opposed to others or anything?
Yeah, in some ways, I think the Secular Student Alliance is the group with the most dynamism and growth in recent years. I think maybe they're tapering off right now because there's just a saturation point you reach when you're putting these groups on college campuses. But their conferences are really interesting. They draw a lot of people. They have a lot of energy. They have a lot of brilliant young leaders. And I think that movement leaders are conscious, secular movement leaders are conscious of the fact that they have to kind of funnel that energy out of the college leaders into other groups. And so I believe there's now a formal partnership with the Center for Inquiry to kind of funnel some of that energy into more adult, permanent structures.
I see. And so does that tell us something about the ideology of the Secular Student Alliance, that they are partnering with the Center for Inquiry?
To be honest, we're not talking about that many people. Mm-hmm. So we're talking probably more about personal relationships than strong ideological differences. And these groups can in some ways shift or very subtly shift their ideological commitments. A good example is AHA in the early 2000s. They really start to move away from religious humanism and talking much more about atheism. They do that under the leadership of Roy Speckhart. And so there are ways in which these groups under particular leaders with partnerships they've built with people they're friends with can shift subtle ways and emphasize particular things. But yeah, AHA has its history and CFI has its more hardline history. That's absolutely true.
And then finally, speaking of campuses, there's a trend toward having humanist chaplains on campuses, right? I mean, at least you see a fair number of them at major schools, and I don't think you saw many 50 years ago. Is that a thing? And if so, is it a coherent thing, or is it, in other words, to the extent, in terms of the things we've been discussing, like the pluralism versus exclusivism and militancy versus whatever, is there any coherence here, or is this just like different, these things are sponsored by different groups and different campuses and...
Yeah, I think it's a thing, and I think it's coherent, and I think I'm being someone who studies atheism in a religious studies department. I think of it as a restructuring of American religion. I think what we call religion is becoming broader. I think people are more and more willing to recognize that what we've long called atheism, which is really a term for a Christian heresy, as it's through most of its history, has something with positive contents. And what are those positive contents? So you see a push in the military as well for humanist chaplains. That we see it on university campuses makes sense. I think as you move out of that intense Cold War binarization, that secular religious are opposed and must be exclusive, you actually find all kinds of interesting hybrids. And this is what we're seeing. And as you find these hybrids, you find this really interesting tension between secularism is the thing that's supposed to manage all these different groups and how they relate, and secularism as one position among many. How do you negotiate that? So I think as there's a kind of recognition that these are deeply held commitments that are maybe even organizing in ways that appear religious, or if I can throw out the $1 million scholarly term, isomorphic to religion, then maybe we're actually looking at a new American pluralism. We're looking at a restructuring. And I think there are a lot of consequences to that shift. And it's happening slowly, but there are a lot of signs.
Okay. And in any event, humanist chaplaincy thing seems to be a growing thing. It's still, there's more and more of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what it represents is consistent with other things we're seeing as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, listen, we've been talking close to an hour, and your image started to get a little blurry, and the sound started to break up a little, and I think that's because, as it happens, it's 5 o'clock. I think what has happened is you're on a college campus. I think a bunch of students just like got out of their final exams or something and started furiously downloading pornographic videos or something. Or possibly not pornographic. Let's give them some credit. Let's give the new secular generation some credit here.
If it's Game of Thrones, it's still pornographic.
Yeah, the line is increasingly blurry.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. And anything you want to plug in closing? Is there a Twitter handle you want to get people to follow you on, or anything you want to talk about?
I don't know. Actually, I think I'm good. I don't have a big public presence. I'm mostly focused on teaching here now.
Okay, well, I admire your lack of self-promotional instincts. That lack is an all too rare thing in modern society.
Well, thank you.
I encourage you to continue in that humble vein. But thanks so much. It's been very informative, and maybe we'll have a chance to come back and talk down the road.
All right, that sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.